My name is Matt Birkhold. As Keisha hinted to, I've been around the Boggs Center since about 2007, I think. And we'll get into all this. And tonight, what I'm here to talk about is, it's on the screen, right? Lessons from Detroit, Visionary Organizing Lab, and the 6 components of visionary organizing. And what I'll talk about tonight, and then we'll have a discussion. Normally I'm a facilitator. I don't do presentations like this very often, but you get a room like this is often just the easiest way to do it. So that's what we're doing. And what's going to come out of my mouth tonight and what you'll see up here is the product of years of relationship and engagement with the Boggs Center and the visionary organizers around the Boggs Center. The term visionary organizing, I'm gonna define it, right, as we at Visionary Organizing Lab define it, right? And we literally call it an approach to change that supports people, communities, teams, and individuals to equally emphasize their material and non-material needs. And it consists of six components, right? So what are material and non-material needs? We have a slide to show you. Material needs, right, are those tangible requirements necessary for sustaining life and ensuring physical survival, right? These needs include food, water, shelter, clothing, and healthcare, anything that you need, right, to maintain yourself physically and reproduce life. Your own life, that is, or, the lives of others, I suppose, too, right? And non-material needs, right, are those intangible requirements necessary for healthy social, psychological, spiritual, and emotional development, right? These needs include love, care, security, safety, recognition, identity, community, and dignity. The shorthand I like to use is material needs are those we need satisfied to survive, and non-material needs are those we need to satisfy to thrive. And this comes out of this. When I say this, what I mean is this equal emphasis on material and non-material needs comes from recognizing for the last 400 to 500 years, right? Since Columbus, landed in the Caribbean and mistakenly thought it was India and called it, and hence its name, the West Indies. We've lived in a world that has emphasized material needs and in many ways just completely ignored that non-material needs even exist. Like I still remember Mr. McCormick's 3rd grade class, and he was like, human beings have 3 needs, food, water, shelter. Right, I still remember that, right? And he was right, those are 3 of our needs, but it's not all of our needs, right? As I got older, right, I began to, I got a need for love. I got a need for community. I got a need for healthy identity, for recognition, for all of these things that aren't about my survival, right? And because we've lived in a world that is so thoroughly rooted around economic growth and material needs, right? We call visionary organizing as a corrective to that, a practice of 6 components that allow communities, organizations to equally emphasize our material needs for survival and our non-material needs for thriving. This comes out of, right, and there are 6 components. Good thing I have these notes. There are 6 components, right? And I want to name, right, we don't consider these components like a linear series of steps that you go through. I often say it's best to think of these components as like an interconnected web of habits, right? And these are, right, connecting to and trusting our inner wisdom, locating ourselves in systems of history, recognizing and nurturing interdependence, imagining new possibilities, affirming dignity, and experimenting with transformation, right? And these come from a very particular experience, right? These weren't just plucked out the air. These weren't just 6 nice things to do. Instead, after coming back and forth between New York City and here for a long time, hanging out with people like Kim, hanging out with people like Myrtle, Wayne, Monique, Tyrone, Curtis, and all the folks at Feed and Freedom Growers, hanging out with people like Ron Scott, who's been on my heart a lot recently. Rest in peace, Ron Scott. Had a lot of wonderful conversations with Ron in this room and directly below us on the 1st floor. Julia Putnam, Blair Evans, just a whole host of people, right? And I want to name, right, that much of what I've learned from Detroit, and hence the name Lessons of Detroit, is specific to the years like 2008 to about 2013. Right? I haven't spent a lot of time here after, say, 2017 or so, but from 2008 to 2013, I was back and forth from New York to Detroit very, very regularly. And one of the things, right, that brought me here in the first place, I was in 2007 or 8, must have been 2007. I was in an organization called the National Hip Hop Political Convention. And we used to write these position papers that would basically say, you're an idiot for these reasons, and no, you're an idiot for these reasons, right? This is the stupidest position I've ever heard. Like, it was a very inhumane organizational environment, right? And it was the kind of organization which was very common at the time, right? That your ideas, your positions were what mattered. And they mattered way more than how you actually treated people and how you took up space and so on and so forth. Again, I'm talking to you, this is only 2007. It would have been unheard of for people to open a conversation like this with their pronouns, right? Absolutely unheard of, right? And it's less than 20 years ago, right? And so I come from a movement background that is far closer to the 1960s than to what we now know and take for granted around movement culture, particularly right after it comes out of Black Lives Matter and the Occupy movement and horizontalism rather than, you know, what we used to call democratic centralism, but that's a whole other conversation, right? And as a member of the convention, I was leading the study groups in New York and Philadelphia. I would go between New York and Philadelphia and lead the political education workshops in the organization and the locals there. And at some point I came across the work of James Boggs. The people who trained me to organize in Philadelphia were people who were in an organization with James and Grace in the 1960s, a guy by the name of Muhammad Ahmed, who would travel from Philly to Harlem and Philly to Detroit. He would convene with Malcolm X in New York and then kind of serve as a go-between between Jimmy and Grace and Malcolm. And Muhammad, when I was in Philadelphia, he would come to a study group that was at our house, and Muhammad trained me as an organizer. And I think I got introduced to Grace through him because they were in an organization called the Organization for Black Power in 1965. And I began to incorporate some of Jimmy's work, particularly the American Revolution, into these study groups. And at some point I said, you know what, I ought to know something about these people who I'm reading. And so I picked up Grace's autobiography. And there was a footnote. It was like, you know, we read all these pamphlets in the 70s, and if you want them, contact the Boggs Center. So I sent the Boggs Center an email. I heard back from Grace. I have family in Grosse Pointe, and I was coming for Thanksgiving, and Grace was like, well, come by the house. And we had this conversation, me, Grace, and a brother named Rick Feldman, who I get the feeling most of y'all know. Had a conversation downstairs, and then Rick brought me up here and gave me a bunch of pamphlets, and he didn't charge me for anything. And I remember him saying, I can just hear Jimmy cussing me out right now for giving these. You can't give these things away for free. How are we gonna support the organization? And I have very vivid memories of of Jimmy being in Rick's ear. But I was drawn to the ideas of the Boggses for a whole bunch of reasons, but primarily because of how they articulated what they called the fundamental contradiction of U.S. history. And they talked about, they called that, a contradiction between our economic and technological overdevelopment on one hand and political social underdevelopment on the other, right? And this is from a chapter in Racism and the Class Struggle, which I suggest all of y'all buy. It's on that black shelf. Keys is holding it up right now. The essay the chapter that this quote is from is called Uprooting Racism and Racists in the USA. It's written in 1970, and to this day, I think remains probably the best thing ever written on the relationship of racism and capitalism, right? And what this, and it's in this piece where Jimmy first articulates this contradiction. And he exposes what it means, right? He talks about this social political underdevelopment, right? By saying, in the course of making America a unique land of opportunity, right? And this is the technological and economic overdevelopment. This land of opportunity in which whites climb up, sorry, there's a typo there, in which whites climb up the social and economic ladder on the backs of blacks. The American people have become the most materialistic, the most opportunistic, the most individualistic, in some, the most politically and socially irresponsible people in the world is what that should say. They're not the most responsible people in the world. That should say irresponsible people in the world, right? And Jimmy would raise the question, right? And he would talk about the invention, the development of the atomic bomb. And say, for the first time, human beings had to ask ourselves, just because we can do something, should we? Right? And technology had developed to such a point where we could eradicate huge swaths of the human population at the press of a button. Right? And hence, right, the US is still to this day the only country in human history to have dropped an atomic bomb on a country. Right, demonstrates, right, that we didn't have, in Jimmy's opinion, the moral, social, or political development to usefully use the technology we had developed. Right, so the question that emerges out of this understanding of the fundamental contradiction of U.S. history, right, is how can we achieve the political and moral development required to cope with the present stage of technological development? And it's this question that draws, and this comes from the introduction to Revolution and Evolution of the 20th Century, this question. It's page 17. I don't have that memorized. I just looked it up and wrote it down and I remember it. And it's this question that drew me to the work of Jimmy and Grace. It was this understanding of history. It was this understanding of how social change in the United States might happen and what it required. Right? I was born in 1979. I got friends who became killers. Right? Regular, everyday people who sold crack because as far as they were concerned, there weren't any other jobs for them that would pay them the kind of money they wanted. And working in that trade meant that you might have to become a killer. Right? I dropped out of high school while awaiting trial. Right? Fled the state and just counted on, my white skin to get me off. Right? And it did. And became an organizer several years later when I developed a language to understand my experience. And then realized I couldn't organize a sock drawer. And then I was in this organization with these people who talked these good ideas but treated each other terribly. And thought that folks who were selling drugs, who were hustling, were already ready to be activists, were already ready to be organizers. And I was like, no, they're not. I was like, you can't be a predator in a community and organize it at the same time. Right? It requires a process of transformation. And it was in this question of how can we achieve the political and moral development required to cope with the present stage of technological development that I found an opening into, right? Being like, oh, wow, these are people who are concerned with how we have to transform ourselves, which you got laughed out of movement circles for saying in 2007-8. Like literally laughed out of. My partner and I, we've been together 14 years. And one of the things that brought us together was that we shared a value in the combined necessity of personal and political transformation. Right? And we found like, oh, word, you believe this too? Because no one else did. Right? And so this is the moment that my interest in the Boggs comes out of. And so I get here, I have this conversation with Grace and them, and I begin to come back and forth a lot. I see Ron Scott doing the Peace Zones for Life and the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality. I see Julia creating this school. I'm hanging out with folks from Allied Media Projects. And I'm asking Rick, Grace, Shay, folks around the center, I'm like, yo, I want to know how they saying move to Detroit. And I'm like, yo, I don't want to move to Detroit. I'm a New Yorker. I ain't moving to Detroit. I have a partner in New York. She sure ain't moving to Detroit. Right? And we talking Detroit 2010, 11, like the vacant lots that are all here now was just houses that looked like they was ready to collapse. My partner, Amaka, came here for the first time in probably 2011. And she looked around and she was like, yo, this looks like Katrina. This looks like New Orleans after Katrina. Right? And what we saw in Detroit as just the result of capitalist disinvestment and the natural course of capitalist history, it took one of the largest hurricanes in human history to create in other places. Right? She wasn't moving here. I loved her more than I, was willing to consider moving here. And so I was faced with this question: what does this work they doing in Detroit mean for other places? Grace, Shay, Rick, they was rooted in Detroit. They was like, things have to get as bad everywhere else in the country as they are here before people to do it. And Ron Scott was like, don't listen to them. Ron was like, that ain't necessarily true. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it can't be true. And it was important to me because I saw Ron, I saw folks like Kim, who wasn't doing a lot of work then, but she was around these conversations. And I talked to people who were growing food, who were engaged in community-based conflict resolution. And they were telling me that they were different people after participating in those kinds of projects than they were before doing them. These were human beings who were aware of a kind of power that they possessed that they weren't aware of before they started to create, right? What we were calling alternative institutions at the time. Today we'll call them visionary organizing projects, right? And they became more fully human, right? They developed the moral capacity to make decisions differently around money and technology, right? And so I had this conversation, January 2nd, 2012. Literally, January 2nd, 2012. I love that the date is up there. And it came up like in my memories a little while ago. And I was like, yo, I need to take a picture of that so I can use it. I have like this 4-hour conversation with Wayne, Myrtle, Monique, who was then pregnant with Seti, who's now the human being that's now Seti, and Tyrone. And we had this amazing 4-hour conversation about their work in the garden. And clearly I was so moved that I came back and, wrote this status where I was like, it's only when human beings think we can't produce our own subsistence that the conditions for capitalism's survival are created. Shout out to Myrtle, Wayne, and Feed 'em Freedom for illustrating this for me. Right, and Wayne and Myrtle clearly enjoyed the conversation too. But I had this moment where I was like, if we begin to do the kind of work that these folks at Feed 'em Freedom are doing, the capitalist economy becomes unnecessary. And I was like, oh. And if capitalism requires us to be dependent on a market to survive, then why would we believe in any power we have? Right? And I'm coming from New York, where it's like, as recent as, 2015, you can get Jordans for about $50. I don't need to create nothing. I can buy anything I want. And I saw these people in Detroit. There were no stores, right? And commerce wasn't only conducted on the internet yet. People still went to stores to shop at this time. And I saw these people who couldn't go to the store to get what they wanted. They couldn't even go to a grocery store because there weren't any of those. And I saw them tap into this creative power, and I was like, oh, if we really rock with this, we can create new systems that can make capitalism or patriarchal racial capitalism irrelevant. And so from this conversation with Wayne, Myrtle, and Feed 'em Freedom growers, I began to understand or explore or believe that the key to learning how to do this work outside of Detroit was in this question. How do people connect or reconnect to the creative capacity to shape reality that patriarchal racial capitalism hides from us and heal from the damage it does to us and nature? I'm gonna read that one more time. How do people connect or reconnect to their creative capacity to shape reality that patriarchal racial capitalism hides from us and heal from the damage it does to us and nature? right? Because after this conversation with Wayne and Myrtle, what I had seen, I was like, oh, these people have reconnected to a creative capacity that most of us just aren't connected to. They did it by growing food. Ain't no ground in Brooklyn to grow food on. What's it look like for people in, San Francisco, in Philly, right? In cities where there's not all kinds of land. How do they reconnect to this creative capacity? And after having spent a lot more time with Wayne, Myrtle, with Kim, with Ron, with all these folks around the Boggs Center, I'll tell you about this in a second. We came to understand that through doing these 6 things as an interconnected web of practices and habits, the default, right? If you do these 6 things, people reconnect to that creative capacity and begin to heal. If you just do some of them, you might reconnect to the creative capacity, but not necessarily heal. You do some of them, you might just heal and not, connect to anything larger. But if you do all 6, you're going to do both. Right? And we came to this conclusion. These people here, this is a collective called Growing Roots. That's almost all of us. That's my chin made a rare appearance in that picture. I don't think anybody ever saw it afterwards. And we had this question, and we formed a collective of people in New York to explore it. And we hadn't yet articulated this question, but it was like, yo, how do we learn how to do this kind of work they're doing in Detroit here in New York? Right? That's me, that's Grace, Sean Lynn, Amaka, my partner, Joanne, John, and Casey. A couple of other folks, Akima, and I'm probably forgetting a couple other names. We would meet weekly and we would read these things, and we came out here and hung out with Grace and had a conversation with her and Shay and Rick, and then we split. It was amicable. Like we couldn't decide what to do together. Some of us were like mad, like 3 or 4 of us lived in one neighborhood. Other people were like, yo, I don't want to do anything in that neighborhood because I don't live there and I feel some kind of way about it. Right. And so we split. And one of the things that split gave birth to was Visionary Organizing Lab. And we, after beginning we got a grant to make a couple films. I got to interview Kim in a long-term form. I got to interview Wayne and Myrtle in a long-term form. A bunch of other people. And what we finally were able to learn is that, oh, these people do these 6 things. Their work in many ways, and this is not to say all they do, and they might not use this language. Right? But at the end of the day, you can see these 6 things at play in their work. And so we're going to take a few minutes and just go through each of these things in places where these components are visible in their work. So we're going to start with imagining new possibilities. We call this the ability to create, put forth, and see visions of the kinds of communities and organizations that meet our material and non-material needs. Imagining new possibilities shows rather than tells. When these folks were in Detroit, Sean, my man with the hat in the middle, the Asian cat with the hat, he had this bottle, this metal water bottle that had a sticker on it that said, fuck shit up. Right? When we came back from Detroit, I noticed he had crossed out fuck and wrote fix. And I was like, huh. Y'all had a serious, My response was not that serious yet. But it planted seeds to be able to say, oh, this imaginary possibility, it shows rather than tells. Right? And so we see this, right? What the praxis looks like, the Boggs School, right? It started with answering the question, what should kids know? And if a student spent 12 years with us, who would we want standing before us? By answering that question, all of a sudden it becomes possible to show people the work you're engaged in. Right? It's like, yo, we want this kid who can fix a toaster, who can read, who can do math, and who can be good in relationships. And we can describe how they might get there, right? Burwood House. Kim, taking people in her neighborhood or folks who are just, down with Burwood House more generally to Sweetwater Foundation and Insight Focus. Kim has provided people with, by doing so, she's provided people with an opportunity for people to see how their material needs might get met in ways that also intentionally meet, that should say non-material needs. Sorry, I did a very poor job proofreading this. Right, but Kim has organized these trips to go to these places where folks are living and meeting their needs differently. And by seeing this activity, people are empowered to imagine new ways to meet their own needs, right? And I love this story that Kim tells, right? She takes people to these trips to Insight Focus and to Sweetwater, and these people who took this trip come back and begin to care for a vacant lot and call it Gathering Place. Right? You know what I mean? Like they see this and then come back, and seeing these things allow us to imagine new ways to do things. Hence Sean's water bottle, going from fuck shit up to fix shit up. Right? And finally with Feeding Freedom Growers, right, by growing food on the block, neighbors are literally seeing and experiencing that new ways of securing food is possible and that food can be accessed in ways that build community. Right? And when you can show folks, you ain't gotta try to convince them. Right? And the next component we'll talk about, we'll show this real quick.
We're bold enough to envision a future where everyone has basics, the basics of what they need to propel all of us to a different future. All of us. Even the haters.
Right? And by creating a place where people can come to see and experience new ways of meeting material needs while having their non-material needs for community met, right? Everybody gets to see a different way to live, as Monique says, even the haters. And then affirming dignity. Creating practices and spaces that make people feel loved and respected, and that who they are matters without having to earn it. Affirming dignity is central to the practice of developing movements that are rooted in critical connections rather than critical masses. Right? Mass movements are like, yo, I need you 15 people in here. I need your bodies so that we can show this sign of force and enforce these people to bend to our will. Right? That's really important sometimes. Right? And we see how important that is in part in watching, right, the brave souls and citizens of Minneapolis fight ICE. It's also not going to get us a new food system. Right? And that kind of mass movement work is functions under what we might call unilateral power. Whereas this critical connection work, right, functions using what we might call relational power. Right? And by affirming dignity, we can draw people into the practice of relational power, right? And we see, right, Ebony at Feeding Freedom Growers demonstrate how Feeding Freedom Growers did this for her.
I was a student at the University of Michigan. At the time I was a sophomore, and I participated in a program called Semester in Detroit. So I had an urban farming class. And so during the first part of the class, we read one of Grace Lee Boggs' books. And then later on, we also read a book by Raj Patel called Stuffed and Starved. And then our professor pretty much told us, all right, it's time to hit the ground, actually do some work. I've been reading. It's time to see what it's really about. And so we volunteered at Feed and Freedom. And so being at FFG during that short period of time, I felt seen and I felt heard and I felt loved in that sense, despite them not really knowing me like that. I mean, Baba, we got that connection. But being there, I felt it, and I felt the potential of roots being, you know, dug deep there. And I felt like they wanted me to be there, not like it was just some program. All right, we done, peace. You know, door shut, you know, Martin, get out. You know, it wasn't none of that. It was, all right, y'all, how can we help you all? Like, what can we do? After the program, that was it. I came back and volunteered maybe twice that summer, and I went back to Ann Arbor. And that was, like I said, in 2014. But then I told myself, Every year I was like, you need to go back. You're going to go back once you graduate. Because at the time I was like, well, I'm going to do a gap year. You're going to have the time to do all this stuff. And so 2017 came and my old phone that had her phone number was like done. And so I was like, shoot, I don't have her number, but I know where she stays. So then, I grabbed my mama. We came down here. We knocked on her door. We prayed like, I hope she here. We knocked on the door. She opened up. We like, hey. And so we came in and we had the conversation in her living room. And she was just like, I'm here. What you want to learn and what you want to do. And so from that point on, that's when I, started dedicating my time to FFG. And so she was willing to pull me in, introduce me to different folk who were part of FFG at that time and other people who weren't a part of FFG. And that's how we got the ball growing and rolling. It was just through, her being like, all right, come on. As she said, come on, Ladybug,
And I want to name there, right? When we trying to create these projects, we can't do them alone, right? We can't do them alone. What Ebony's experience tells me is that, right, she was, introduced to FFG just through a school program and then went back to college. But she said, I felt seen and I felt heard. And she was like, yo, I got to get back there. Right, like 2 years after she went, was first there, it was that feeling seen, that it didn't feel like a program, Martin, get out, right? It didn't feel like we just here using you. It didn't feel like I'm just a body here for these people. I felt seen and I felt heard, right? And that's the essence of affirming dignity as a component of visionary organizing, right? And so we like to say, right, that imagining new possibilities puts the visionary in visionary organizing, and affirming dignity puts the organizing in visionary organizing, right? Movements rooted in critical masses utilize the formula educate, agitate, organize to build critical masses that can force their will on those in power. Visionary organizing builds critical connections by showing people that other ways of living are possible, and then attracts or draws them to these other ways of living by affirming their dignity. Right? Ebony comes in and Myrtle is like, what do you want to learn? I've heard Ebony tell that story other times, and Myrtle is like, yo, what do you have to contribute? It ain't just we gonna serve you. So no, you have a contribution to make here too. Who you are is important. And you got contributions to make. And it's in that kind of experience where Ebony is like, yo, I want to work with those people. That's way different than the way I was trained to organize, where it's like you convince people to come join you out of right. Aren't you angry? Aren't you? And Marxists use the phrase rub raw the wounds of oppression. Saying, yo, you got something to give. And in the context of a vision, we can live this different way. How do you want to contribute to it? What do you have to contribute to it? Right? Those are the components of visionary organizing, imagine new possibilities and affirming dignity. And it's because of the function they play that we say, right, imagine new possibilities puts the visionary in visionary organizing, and affirming dignity puts the organizing in visionary organizing. Right? And as a web of interconnected practices, right? And if you've ever tried to affirm people's dignity, if you ever had a relationship with somebody, look here, you know what I mean? Let me be in a bad mood and let my partner say something that I don't particularly like or want to hear, right? If I'm not rooted, I'm like, what'd she say to me? Right? And I don't act on that, but I have the thought. All right, Matt, calm down. She ain't mean nothing by that, right? I can't practice affirming dignity if I'm not also taking care of myself. Right? And one of the ways we do that with visionary organizing and the components is by connecting to and trusting our inner wisdom. Right? And we define that as recognizing that our intuition can be trusted and provides or represents a spiritual logic for navigating life that is naturally attuned to the collective, material, and non-material needs of an interdependent world and life. I don't know about y'all, but when I listen to my inner wisdom, I see things I don't normally see. I can show up in ways that I don't normally show up. Just this morning, my neighbor who just had hip surgery called me. He was like, yo, can you help me move my truck? I got to take some trash, X, Y, and Z. And I had to take a shower and get to the airport. And the wisdom was like, go help Eddie. Right? And it started my day right. You know what I mean? Like, and that's like connected to and trusting my inner wisdom. Conventional logic was like, yo, you got to get to the airport. My inner wisdom was like, you got to be there for this dude. Right? And so we see this in praxis, right? Kim, I love this, right? Kim tells this story. And this is not a quote from Kim. Part of it is, but it's how I've written the quote too. I'm not, Kim, I ain't putting no words in your mouth. Right? Kim says, it was probably one of the toughest things I had to do. I didn't want anybody hurt, and I certainly didn't want anyone to get killed. I also didn't want the culture of the block to change. And Kim is saying this in response to increased drug activity in her neighborhood, right? And she says, you know what? I'm gonna call the police next time I see it. And she has this conversation with Ron Scott because Kim personally knew a particular police officer. She says, Ron, I know this dude, I'm gonna call him. And Ron is like, don't call him. I know that cat, somebody's gonna get hurt or even killed. Right? And so Kim is like, I didn't want anybody hurt. I didn't want anybody killed. Kim says, right, Kim's inner wisdom spoke to her and she listened. It was at that point I decided I was going to take what Ron said as a personal challenge to not call the police and that I would figure out a way to do something different. Kim listened to that intuition from her inner wisdom, and it forced her to imagine new possibilities for meeting people's non-material need for safety. And Kim asked the question, right? How would I find ways to interact with our neighbors so that I didn't have to call the police? Right? And so connecting to and trusting our inner wisdom not only is like, yo, yeah, the world really is the mess that I think it is, but it's also going to lead me in a way where it's like, oh, I can figure out how to live differently. Recognizing and nurturing interdependence. We call this, right, seeing the interconnections that make life possible and then using relational power to shape these interconnections in ways that affirm life.
Feed and Freedom Growers is not a magic pill. It's an urban space. It's a garden. We grow food, but we're growing our souls while we're there, because we're getting in touch with some patience. We're getting in touch with our interconnectedness with the soil, what comes out of the soil. You can't do this work by yourself, so you need others. So you're building these relationships. And then you're in touch with all the environmental impacts that happen. Then you got to get in touch with the city structures of what happened. So a lot, layer upon layer upon layer. It's a growth process if you allow yourself.
So as Myrtle is talking about, right, all these layers upon layers, right? We see her seeing the interconnections that make life possible and then using relational power to shape them in ways that affirm life. Monique has this quote that blew my mind from that 2012 conversation. And this literally gets to recognizing and nurturing interdependence as well. Because we're reliant and dependent on capitalism for survival, we don't know what we're capable of and responsible for. Before working in the garden, Monique was a grocery store aisle shopper who didn't think much about where her food came from or what was in it. The food was just there. Then after working in a garden for just a few months, she began to ask, who's doing this for me when I go to the store and what do I owe them? Right? As a result of seeing those interconnections that Myrtle talked about in the garden, Monique began to understand herself as part of an interconnected world. And goes to the store and is like, yo, not just who did this for me, but like the moral question, what do I owe them? Right? And we sit here and think about the reality that there's something happening here for Monique and for Myrtle where it's like, oh, I've connected to these interconnections and I want to nurture them. Right? And so we call it recognizing and nurturing interdependence. Locating ourselves in systems and history, right? This is literally recognizing that we, our collective history, Our communities, organizations, and institutions are the product of interdependent human responses, including resistance to and support of systems that force us to emphasize material needs over non-material needs. Right? And when we recognize that, we can see that our personal and collective biographies are tied up with and connected to the larger world of which we're a part. We see this in action or the praxis of it. I had this long conversation with Julia way before the school was started. And we're just talking, and she was like, she was talking about being at a training somewhere, some kind of conference. And she says, the whole theme of the day was mapping your neighborhood and understanding the history of your neighborhood and all these resources you can use to map where you are. And then this woman from the school community, from this school, Community High in Brightmoor, Candace Sweet was her name, gave this long history of the Brightmoor neighborhood. Right. And Julia's telling me this story about being 16 years old and wondering why Detroit is so messed up. Right. And she's being fed the narrative about, right, whites left the city and then it fell apart. Right. And it looked like it did when Julia was 16, which is about the same time I was, which was like sometime between 1994 and 1997. Right. And she says, listening to this story, I got teary and thought, this is that moment when I was 16. This is that story I needed to hear about why Detroit looked the way that it looked. And it had nothing to do with me. And it had nothing to do with people who look like me. And it had nothing to do with poor, stupid black people who don't know what the fuck they're doing. It has everything to do with other people who came and didn't know what they were doing and left us this. And it was just like how healing that would have been for me as a kid, looking around to not blame myself and to have some kind of context to put it in. Right? By understanding that problems aren't necessarily the fault of individuals, but of a larger historical process and system. Really, it creates the room for us to get right-sized. Right? We get a little humility from that. And then it's like, oh, wait, this is the fault of, I didn't cause this. People that look like me didn't cause this, right? And so on one level, locating ourselves in systems and history, right, that biography piece, that autobiographical piece is like the healing energy that comes from practicing humility, from just being right-sized. It also means on a larger kind of structural, historical, political level, what time is it on the clock of the world? Right? We locate ourselves in systems, as Julia said, we locate ourselves in through the process that Julia talked about. We locate ourselves in history by asking the question or answering the question, what time is it on the clock of the world?
Where are we? In a time of enormous change. It is not the end of days. It is a period of endings, but that's not all. Endings are also beginnings, and our period is the kind of ending and beginning that people experience only every few hundred years. In Europe, the Stone Age ended, and the Middle Ages began. Then the Middle Ages ended, and the modern period began. Now the modern period is ending, and something new will emerge. What emerges depends on us. What a time to be alive.
And so when we talk about locating ourselves in systems and history in a large scale historical political way, and we ask this question, what time is it on the clock of the world? And Grace used to say this all the time, and it was one of the things that brought us together was our shared belief in this, is that we're in a period of large scale systems transition, right? The modern age, synonymous with patriarchal racial capitalism, cannot continue reproducing itself. It's run out of land to expand on. It can no longer extract from nature, quote unquote, without cost. It's incorporated workers all over the world, so there are no new workers to incorporate. Right? It's inherently unstable because of all those reasons, right? So we're at this moment where we've got a declining system that we can provide hospice care for, and these networks, right? People doing work like Kim, like Wayne and Myrtle, like Julia, these networks of community self-reliant experiments can develop into a new system, can develop into communities of practice, and finally a new system that can replace patriarchal racial capitalism. Right? And so we're at a moment in history where the kind of visionary organizing work being done on the ground in Detroit and other places, because of this historical moment we're in, has the potential to culminate in a vastly new, what we might call a finite social system. And all I mean by that is a system has a beginning, a period of normal functioning, and a decline. Right? And so locating ourselves in systems in history has that dual application of the personal healing energy of it, and then this larger political structural component. And then finally, we talk about experimenting with transformation. And what we mean by that is, right, developing comfort with the process of letting things emerge and making the habit of equally emphasizing material and non-material needs as important as outcomes. Right? Old ways of organizing are only concerned with the outcome, or primarily concerned with the outcome. Right? And the last 500 years of patriarchal racial capitalism is concerned with the outcome. Whatever we got to do to economic growth, we gonna do. To get economic growth, we gonna do. Human survival be damned, we gonna grow the economy. Right? And so experimental transformation means, right, making the habit of equally emphasizing material and non-material needs as important as the outcome. Right? Because we still need food, we still need housing. The outcome ain't unimportant. But in order to take advantage of this moment of large-scale possible transformation, we have to learn to do things differently. And experimenting with transformation helps us get in the habit of making our material and non-material needs as important as the outcome. Kim exemplifies this, right, in just the way that she started Burwood House, right? Having one-on-one conversations with the neighbors, creating some flyers that advertise conversations, and by distributing an alt monthly called Riverwise. Y'all obviously know what that is. Kim says, I'm just trying to expose people in my area to things that I have learned and share with them and have them share with me what they know. She once again began to attend meetings of a block club, right? And encourage them to sit in a circle to challenge their hierarchical ways of doing things, right? After struggling to find additional people on the block who are open to her ideas and visions, right? She continued to experiment with transformation by identifying people within 3 miles of her house who she might be able to talk with. Through these conversations, Kim discovered that groups and people had a need for meeting space. Kim then began to host meetings, right? And experiment with transformation by using it to provide meeting space for them, right? And so we see experimenting with possibilities, right? We have an idea, but we hold on to it. You know what I mean? We wear it like a loose garment. And we stay true to those values, but let the practice, let what it needs to look like emerge. Right? And Kim has always been real clear, right? If it don't feel right, we ain't gonna do it. Right? If I can't satisfy the yearnings of my conscience or my inner wisdom, we ain't gonna do it, right? And that's the process of making that emphasis of non-material needs as important as the outcome.
The 291 Cultural Hub is a indoor manifestation of everything that we do at the garden. This is a place where we can reimagine culture. We can have meetings here. We have residential space here for short term. If you want to come here and do your sabbatical, we have a space for you. Mm-hmm.
What's that over there?
We have a music space. We have a Reiki space. We have meeting space. We have a kitchen.
Freedom Growers, as they, continue to do the garden, they then built the cultural hub. Right, and as they began to see, this kind of cultural hub is necessary, we can get this land, we can build this house. They didn't have no idea they was gonna build a house when they started doing Freedom Growers. And just this comfort of letting things emerge to meet emergent needs. Right, and so this last clip is, I wanted to share with y'all too, right, what the possibility of taking these lessons from Detroit around the country and just share with y'all a couple minutes of what Visionary Organizing Lab has been able to do with groups elsewhere by emphasizing these 6 habits, these 6 components, right? And this is a group that we worked with, the United Way of Northern Central New Mexico, who got active in trust-based philanthropy to fund projects like Burwood House or Feeding from the Growers, what we call community self-reliant projects. And so like we literally trained them in these 6 components of visionary organizing and allowed them to do the work as they describe it in their own words.
Being trusted by the funder allows United Way, and me personally, to relax. The things that I usually worry about is pleasing the funder, getting the report in on time, documenting how many people were served, what the color of their skin was, and how big their wallets were. None of that exists here. Knowing that we had that 3 years to get the project up and running allowed us to focus on the work and not worry about where the resources were coming from. That is a gift of peace of mind that is uncommon in the kind of work that we do. We wanted them to have that same peace of mind that they had 3 years to carry out a project, knowing that it would be funded for the 3 years. That allows them to focus on the work.
This has been a wonderful journey for us as a United Way. Not necessarily one that has been easy, but has been very rewarding. And I would just have to say that our relationship with the Visionary Organizing Lab has been central to our ability to make the difference that we've made in community. Because, conceptually, we were talking about what it means to exist differently, what it means to really function outside the traditional nonprofit culture, but that was up in the sky. Visionary Organizing Lab has really brought that down to earth to where we could actually get our arms around it and really make a difference in our communities. I think it does take a different work culture to really be successful in this work. A workplace culture that values non-material needs is so important to the work of resilient communities because it is necessary for you to be a whole person in order to do this work.
We did not want to do our traditional RFP process, request for proposals. We decided early on, our CEO, Rodney, in his wisdom, decided early on to keep resilient communities on a separate track from that, and that we really wanted to do things differently. And we even started to talk about and try to create new linguistic terms. So instead of a proposal, we created the concept of a dream-posal. We wanted people to dream about how they could exist differently. Ibrahim went and he even included a rough budget. And I noticed at one point that when the other dream proposals came in, they were perfectly fine. And I started to fall back into the old RFP traditional philanthropy thing. And I said to Tira and Valerie, I said, well, they didn't include a budget. We need to have a budget. And I remember Valerie said something like, I don't think we need to have a budget, and Tira said something like, yes, remember, this is trust-based philanthropy. We wouldn't have reached out to them if we didn't already know that they're doing good work and trust that, the money is in good hands. That was a moment where I was able to take a breath and almost relax. It wasn't that, we're treating everybody like they're gonna embezzle the money and we're in that kind of framework of scarcity and fear. We're trying to go with a dream proposal. In fact, I think I might have come up with the word, but even I still backslide. We're all socialized into this current system of scarcity and fear and distrust. And so it's helpful to have colleagues who can kind of pull you back sometimes.
So we end experimenting with transformation with that clip because the work that Visionary Organizing Lab did with those folks, like these are people who cut the check. Right, and we trained them and taught them how to do the things that Kim is doing, that Myrtle is doing, not, not opening their home in that way, not growing food, but those 6 habits that Kim, Myrtle, and visionary organizers practice gave these people the skills to say, oh wait, I've fallen back into this old way of thinking. because they can recognize and nurture interdependence around them. They're like, oh, yeah, we don't need a budget. We can trust these people. Right? And so we've seen that when people, regardless of where they are, begin to practice these 6 habits or components, these 6 components as an interconnected web of habits, they begin to show up differently. They begin to reconnect to that creative capacity to transform reality and take it really seriously. And that's why we end there. One of the things that we've seen, right, is that an individual like Kim or a group of people like Feeding Freedom Growers, they practice the components of habits. And then when they begin to experiment with transformation, this group or individual create opportunities for increasing people to also practice the components of habits, or the components as habits in an organized way. About VOL, what we do, right, we teach people these things. We teach people in organizations these components, right? We're a learning lab for social and cultural transformation that supports people to create self-reliant communities and vision-led organizations. We create media to help people imagine new possibilities, and we offer programs for individuals, students, and organizations that teach the components of visionary organizing. We also offer strategic visioning and other customized services for organizations and workplaces where we don't teach the components, but use them in our facilitation. Right? I'm in town right now because we're doing a strategic visioning process with an organization called Solidarity. Where as a facilitator, I use these components without, beating people over the head with them, right? Because we're showing rather than telling. If you want to get with VOL, we have a new class coming up. It begins April 13th to May 18th. It's called How Did This Happen? Understanding Our Economic System. It's a 6-week class on Monday nights on Zoom, and we're calling it How Did This Happen? Understanding Our Economic System, because it's a strategic way to not use the word capitalism, and therefore, we're trying to stay below the radar and just be strategic. So that QR code is the Eventbrite. If you want to register, it's pay what you can. There's a sliding scale and a pay what you can option. I see somebody taking a picture, getting the QR code, so I'll wait a second before we go to the next joint.
Will we get these slides?
We can, yeah, we can work that out, yeah. And finally, you can follow VOL. Our YouTube channel is @Visionary Organizing Lab. The Instagram is @Visionary Organizing. And then finally, you can join our email list with at that QR code. I didn't plan on talking that long, so my apologies. But I want to thank y'all for hanging out and open it up for any reflections, criticisms, comments, questions, rejections, jokes, or amusing anecdotes. Go ahead, Keisha.
Hi. Well, first, never ever say that you're not a good presenter. All right. I really enjoyed everything you shared. I really see the philosophy of you embracing a totally different way now. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that overview.
Keisha, say more about how you see it differently, please.
Well, it's like I gather different lessons from their writings, but to just be able to connect the dots, right? Because I see them they're kind of separated, like knowing the role in the arc of history, but then also visionary organizing. I never see them all connected.
Okay.
So it's like you're saying these are the 6 components and they're all connected. I always just think of like, oh, they did a dope analysis of history. That's
Right.
really cool. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? But to say no, these are all connected to being able to have a visionary. You know what I'm saying? That's right.
Okay. Thank you, Keisha.
Yeah.
Other comments, reflections, questions, criticisms. Phoenix.
Yeah, I think it feels like this is a map of the mycelium network. And I've been waiting for a really long time to put some pieces together, and this feels like a really big missing piece. And it filled some places in me that I'm so grateful to have filled. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to getting this seeded out in my community.
Thanks, Phoenix. Any other Tim? Is it Tim?
I had 2. One, I was really intrigued with that that two-loop model. I've never seen that. And I think that the majority of your work is the new systems and how you do that. So like I don't want to sidetrack from that, but like it was just not to bring my personal baggage into it, but like the hospice care of like the I was like, damn. And what is that? Like I don't think we need to talk about it because that's kind of where we are. Like it's maybe where I've been. That's where. But like, what do you mean? What does that mean?
Thanks, Tim. It is Tim, right?
Yes.
Thanks, Tim. That hospice care first, it comes from Meg Wheatley and Deborah Fries. Like that two-loop model comes out of work that Meg Wheatley and Deborah Fries did together. And when they talked about hospice care, right, and I'll go back to the right, as they lay it out, right, when systems stop working, people start experiments to do things in new ways. And as increasing numbers of people, right, begin to realize, oh, this system doesn't work, more people begin to do these experiments, right? But this system is real. Like, and the example they use is education, it's schooling, right? And I hate the example they use. Like they talk about, right, No Child Left Behind is the emergence of a new education system. And they're not like in favor of it, it's just the example they use. And they're like, there are these people who have these jobs who have to be taken care of in the old system, right? Because it's how they pay their bills and X, Y, and Z, right? That's where the notion of hospicing comes from. The way that we think about it is like, as this system declines, it looks like ICE in Minneapolis. Right? As this system declines, it looks like mass incarceration. It looks like violence. All of the worst aspects of patriarchal racial violence that are oftentimes hidden become real visible. That's what a dying system looks like. It's like an animal with its back in a corner. Right? It attacks. Hospice care is how we make living through that as painless as possible. Right? And so, Tim, as you pointed out, right, the difference between creating the new and being in this system, we need universal health care. We need to abolish the police, to abolish ICE. Right? These are all examples of how, these are all instances or examples of how to make living through this decline as painless as possible. What we might call radical politics as usual. Right? It might look like, restoring the EPA. Right? So that the climate doesn't completely deteriorate. Right? Just anything to enable survival in the most painless way possible as it becomes harder and harder to survive while we build this new work. Right? And that work happens on two different logics. And likely two different kinds of people are needed to do each. And that's okay. Not everybody has to be visionary organizing. But if some people don't do it, all we'll have is hospice care, but nothing to replace the hospice care for the dying system, but nothing to replace it with. If all we do is visionary organizing, we all gonna die with the system. Right? Because the dying system will kill us. Right. Yeah. Like Ron Scott used to ask all the time, right? And he would say, right, growing food is great. And what you gonna do when they burn the farm down? Right? Because Ron's experience as a Panther let him know they was gonna burn the farm down. If all we do is visionary organizing, they're going to burn the farm down. Hospice care is about a defensive struggle that allows us to protect the farm, that allows us to protect life more generally. I didn't mean to be quite so dramatic, but it's real.
That's awesome.
Come on, Kim.
So I'm curious about what it looks like outside of Detroit. And who are the people who are involved in visionary organizing, and lastly, what's motivating them. Because I'm going to answer that part in a minute.
Yeah.
What I have experienced is that the motivation comes through crisis and decline. It just doesn't come. You know, like for most people are not proactive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's only when they can see the decline and people go through pain that they react. So outside of Detroit.
I love it.
Outside of Detroit.
Yeah.
Give me some examples.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. I was literally saying, because one of the things that VOL does is a community self-reliance school. And we was literally sitting there last night. Han was in it a couple years ago. It's a 9 or 10 week school where we support people to develop a vision for a community self-reliance project, and then to use the components of visionary organizing to make that project come to reality. And Kim, it was beautiful because last night people were sharing about what they're yearning for, what they envision. And I think out of the 15 people who shared, no less than 10 was simply like, I want to live in a neighborhood where we got each other's backs. And so the motivation that I see that really draws people to this work, right? It's not for everybody, but for people who really are relationship inclined, they drawn to it. Like in my neighborhood in Baltimore, it's called Reservoir Hill. There's the White Lock Community Farm. And it's a sister there by the name of Jen. She's a herbalist, a farmer, she a jack of all trades. And Kim, she motivated by love. Like, that's it, right? She motivated by love, and she wants to see that love in the world. And I think that I love what you're saying about crisis, because those folks might not experience the crisis of water shutoffs, for example, like was the case in Detroit, or the crisis of a lack of grocery stores, which is the case in Baltimore, by the way. But there's the crisis of human relationships. Right? There's the crisis of human relationships. And people want to practice relating to each other differently. Right? And so if there is a crisis they're responding to, it's the crisis of human relationships. It's the spiritual crisis of our world. And they spiritually inclined folks, or heart inclined folks, whatever the correct language is. But there are folks who are initially something about them, they're concerned with our non-material needs. That's a wonderful question, Kim. Thank you. Other reflections, criticisms, rejections? Comments or reflections or questions?
What's next?
For who? For what?
For Visionary Organizing Lab.
We got
other than some
other than the class. We have a book coming out. Keisha made mention of a book. I have a book coming out on, it's called Black Power Praxis, Activist Intellectuals in Detroit's Black Power Movement, which in many ways traces the development of Jimmy and Grace's ideas through the 60s and into the 70s in relationship to other activist intellectuals in Detroit. But Visionary Organizing Lab also has a book coming out called Exist Differently, Visionary Organizing to Create an Age of Repair. And then in April or May, we'll also begin to offer a series of asynchronous, go at your own pace online classes. And those will be we're shooting for April 1st. We experiment with possibilities, so we're trying to get comfortable when things emerge. They'll be up by June at the latest, but our aim date is April 1st. And once again, right, if you want information on those, make sure you follow us there or join the email list, because it'll come out. And we send out monthly newsletters, and then intermittent emails to, be like, don't forget to register for this. The Boggs Center is doing this thing, X, Y, and Z. So yeah, Tim, that's what's on the immediate horizon. Any other questions, comments, reflections? Come on, what's your name?
I'm Kelly.
Come on, Kelly.
So something that really stuck out is you were kind of talking about critical connections versus critical masses, and you also pointed out how not everybody needs to be visionary organizing. There's this place for these different approaches and theories of change. Are there ways that people who are visionary organizers, I guess, how do those two different groups collaborate or find synergy with one another, or do they? Should they? So many questions.
Kelly, that's an amazing question. I think the short answer is they have to.
Yeah.
I think the long answer, one of the things that we found, I was literally just in a conversation with two labor organizers just yesterday. Vonda McDaniel, who's now the co-director of the Hollander Center, and Cindy Estrada, who I know some of y'all in here know. And we were talking about how do we get these labor organizers to also see the importance of community. And one of them was like, well, they're not ready for that. They're not ready for this. Woo, they not ready. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? Right? Because I don't believe they're not ready for it. What do you mean by that? And it's like, well, they just think in these ways and they narrow X, Y. I don't care. It don't mean they have to be that way. And I think that one of the things that I was able to name was that by asking simple questions like, who made your day possible? And putting it in the larger context of, right, the pilot at Delta Airlines made my day possible. Because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the pilot. Which means that the cats who worked who put the plane together, the people that work at Boeing, right? The rubber farmers in Africa who harvested the rubber for the tires, they made my day possible. And when we find ways to illustrate the interconnections of everyday taken for granted life, it supports people to begin to recognize and nurture interdependence in ways that they otherwise probably wouldn't. And in the process, we can see these different kinds of power, relational power and unilateral power, in relationship to each other rather than in competition with each other, which is how the movement has treated these different kinds of practices for years. Right? And so the question for me is just, how do you bring people together in ways that help them recognize and nurture interdependence, and then use that ability to connect these different kinds of struggle in generative rather than oppositional ways? And my experience tells me that, asking questions that help people see or force people to see interdependence is really useful toward that end. Yeah, thank you. We got time for one more. I don't remember your name. Dominic, go ahead.
I'm feeling a lot of urgency, especially watching things in Minneapolis, just like around the fact that a lot of these structures to do that kind of mass mobilization, or even just like that resistance work, which I know is different than the visionary organizing, but I think I'm just feeling a lot of urgency in this moment. Like, this next year is going to be crazy. I mean, obviously the year after that's going to be crazy. The year after that's going to be crazy too. But I'm wondering, like, what do you see as like, I guess it's that question of like, what time is it on the clock of the world? But like, what do you see as like the emergent and urgent like needs this moment?
I'm mad you gonna raise the last question and that's gonna be it. You got timing, Dominic. Everything is urgent.
Yeah.
Survival is urgent. You know what I mean? Like I literally, I've begun to make peace with the very real possibility that humanity might just go extinct. I say that to say everything is urgent. I think what helps me prioritize, and I want to say one thing, right? If you feel a sense of urgency to stop what's happening, follow that. And visionary organizing ain't gonna do that.
Right.
If you bleeding and need to stop it now, visionary organizing ain't the tool you need. But if you want to stop the conditions that facilitate bleeding in the first place, visionary organizing gonna get you there. The bleeding still gotta stop. We need a tourniquet now. And if you feeling that, listen to you, connect to and trust your inner wisdom. Like I just want to, uplift that and name that. I think what gives me perspective is the last time human beings lived through a systems transition was the end of European feudalism and the beginning of the global system of patriarchal racial capitalism. And the transition, the crisis of feudalism in Europe is responded to by the European aristocracy by sending Columbus to the New World, colonizing Latin America, indigenous genocide, the enslavement of Africans, the enclosures of European lands, and the burning alive of women around the world. Finite social systems and old economies don't die peacefully. It's just an objective fact, they don't. And so I don't know if I'm gonna live to see things get better, but I know that if I didn't work to see them get better, I couldn't live with myself. You know what I mean? And so I don't have the wisdom that your question implies you asking me for. But I can share, right, the wisdom I do have and how I make decisions. Right? I know that for me, right, I'm a member of a neighborhood association that practices visionary organizing. And that is where I feel called to do my work, and I do shit like this. Right? And I think that in a moment like this, because it's so critical, the most important thing we can do is be aligned with our conscience. Connect to and trust our inner wisdom. And if it leads us down the path of visionary organizing, I'm gonna see you there. If it leads you down the path of providing hospice care, I'm gonna be like, how we work together. You know, and I think I will say this one last thing. Grace said this to me the first time when I was younger than 30. And she said, Matt, you need to see yourself as contributing to a transition as significant as that, from hunting and gathering to agriculture, and from agriculture to industry. Right? Grace had this ability to say these platitudes that were just amazing and absurd, but also very real. Like, she would casually say things like, being a revolutionary means assuming responsibility for taking all of humanity to another plateau. You know what I mean? Like, but I say that, right, because there's some real richness in that way of thinking about what we're capable of.
Say that again, because what are we capable of, and what are we going to contribute?
Yeah.
Because that's really key.
Yeah, and right.
What's your contribution?
Yeah.
What's the next step?
Yeah.
Whatever we do.
Yeah.
Because everything that we do as individuals is really important.
Yeah, it contributes.
It's serious.
Yeah.
Or don't do.
Yeah, exactly. Because, like, we trapped in an interconnected universe. We trapped in it. So how are we gonna show up for it? So with that, I want to say I love y'all.
You're gonna go get some rest.
You feel me? I gotta go to work in the morning. And thanks for hanging out, y'all. Thanks for your contributions and for just, being here. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Wow, that was so needed. Thank you for taking the time out on your trip here. I would love for you to do it again because I just feel like we need a round two.
This thing happened.